Let me once again welcome you all back to Duke Law School. My name is Guy Charles. I am a law professor here, and I happen to be serving as our Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, or as I like to put it, I work for David. Whatever he tells me to do, I do. It's my pleasure this morning to moderate this panel. We have a wonderful group of people. They are, like all of you, amazing and distinguished alumni. And so I'm going to take just a few minutes to introduce them. And what we'd like to do is they will each have an opening statement of 5 minutes or so. Then we'll take another 5 to 10 minutes to think and talk amongst one another. And then we'll open it up to all of you for you to share all of your wisdom with us. Now, one of the things that our panelists ought to know is that I will hold you to all of your predictions. I want to know what will happen, and I will go to the betting markets and see if I can use your predictions to retire in the next few months. So this is indeed the Forecasting the 2016 Presidential Election Legal and Policy Considerations. We're going to start off with Sean Trende, who's the Senior Elections Analyst for RealClearPolitics and RealClearPolitics.com. He is the author of The Lost Majority, Why Future Government is Up for Grabs and Who Will Take It. He is the co-author of the influential Almanac of American Politics. He practiced law for a number of years at both Kirkland and Ellis and Hunton and Williams. He went to Yale as an undergrad and went to Duke for his law degree as well as for a master's in political science. We will then turn to Sonja Steptoe, who currently serves as the Senior Public Affairs Officer for the government of Fulton County, Georgia, overseeing marketing and communication strategy for $2.9 million Fulton County Department of Health and Wellness partnerships to improve community health program. Prior to her work in strategic communications, she was a journalist and served as the bureau chief's senior correspondent and deputy news director for Time magazine out of LA. She joined Time from People, where she was a senior editor handling human affairs. She went to the University of Missouri-Columbia and, of course, Duke Law. Third, we will have Ms. Barbara Arnwine, who's the founder and president of Transformative Coalition. She is a civil rights activist. If you listen to Radio 1, you will hear her as a host there. She served for a very long time as the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law from 1989 to 2015. She was an attorney at the Durham Legal Assistance Program. She went to Scripps College as an undergrad and, of course, graduated from, this is the theme because this is our alumni weekend, Duke Law. Of course, last but not least, if I may introduce Mr. Tony Harrington. He is the chair of the managing board and heads the Latin America practice at Albright Stonebridge Group, a leading commercial diplomacy and global strategy firm. He was co-chaired by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. He served as U.S. ambassador to Brazil under Presidents Clinton. During his time as ambassador, he oversaw unprecedented bilateral political and economic engagement between the U.S. and Brazil, and in recognition of his accomplishments, he received the Order of Rio Branco Grand Cross from the government of Brazil. Previously, he served as chair of the President's Intelligence Oversight Board, vice chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and a member of the congressionally created Commission on the Roles and Capabilities of U.S. Intelligence Community. Prior to his government service, he was a senior partner at Hogan. He went undergrad at the university that is down the hill, the University of down the road. I did not mean that. I did not mean it. No. I believe in friendly rivalries as long as one of us is on top, so I did not mean it. Down the road. Let us correct that. Down the road at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was a Moorhead Scholar. And of course, he went to Duke Law School. Thank you. All right, so they each will bring a slightly different perspective. And so we'll take a few minutes and they will get their 5 minutes of opening statements. and then we will talk to them and then talk to one another, and hopefully we'll have a great hour. So now let me turn it over to Sean.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's funny, I remember about a year and a half ago talking with my boss saying, my God, I can't believe I'm going to have to cover a Clinton-Bush race. How painful this is going to be. As Rick Terry might say, oops. I'll try to blow through. I actually remember saying to him, if this happens, I might actually go back to practicing law. And he was like, wow, that's really going to be a painful race, isn't it? But 5 minutes, the election. Okay, so we're going to go really fast. The Democratic side, if anyone here I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I think it's fascinating in the big picture, but as far as prognostications, I'm sorry if people here are feeling the burn, but it's no longer interesting. Hillary Clinton is going to be the Democratic nominee, unless she gets hit by a meteor or she gets indicted, which I don't think is going to happen. There just aren't enough delegates left for Sanders. The Republican side, on the other hand, is fascinating and horrifying and all kinds of things all at once. I don't think Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee. It's possible, but I don't think it's going to happen. And to understand why, you kind of have to understand part of why Donald Trump is where he is. It's not that there's this massive wellspring of support. There is a substantial support for Donald Trump in the Republican primary in the party, and blue-collar Democrats that he's bringing in, which is an important, blue-collar white Democrats that he is bringing in, which is an important factor. Part of why Donald Trump has done so well is he has absolutely dominated the media. Someone did a study, and this is shocking. So the last 4 Republicans were Trump, Kasich, Cruz, and Rubio. Okay, these were the people that Republicans were ultimately most interested in. In August, Donald Trump got 63 times as much media coverage as those other 3 combined. He got 10 times as much media coverage as the rest of the Republican field combined. He absolutely sucked the oxygen out of the room, which had 2 effects. First, he's who everyone was talking about, and there's good political science showing that whoever gets the most media coverage, they benefit in the polls. But second, he kept people from learning about the alternative Republican nominees, so that when people started looking around, think about John Kasich. Who had heard about John Kasich really before, say, March? Very few Republicans knew anything about him. He's now the establishment alternative, but no one knows enough about him to decide whether they really want to vote for him or not. I live in Ohio. I say no, but that's a different story. There was some luck involved. You can debate whether it's luck, but what's happened in previous primary contests on both the Republican and Democratic side is that people kind of look around, they play the field, if you will, during the early primary process, and then around December or January, you see a candidate get what I call liftoff. So if you look at the 2004 Democratic race, you have Howard Dean going along here, and everyone's like, oh my God, Howard Dean is actually going to be the nominee, and John Kerry is in 4th place, John Edwards is in 5th. And then all of a sudden in December, you just see this break. And they get liftoff, okay? And the same thing happened with McCain in 2008, who was in 3rd place in December. The same thing happened with Obama in 2008, who was behind Hillary Clinton by 20 points in October of 2007. The same thing happened with Romney. The same thing was happening with Marco Rubio in January. If you look after Iowa, there was this break, and he was starting to get liftoff, and then he got gored by a charging rhino. It works on all sorts of levels. And then he decided that he should start making small hand jokes, and Chris Christie might have done the Republican Party a favor, assuming that Trump doesn't end up the nominee. So that liftoff never occurred. But then there's this giant, and this is where it gets really important, there's been this collective action problem, where if you look at the polling, people have done head-to-head polls, and Trump is rarely ahead in the head-to-head polls. If you look at the polls of South Carolina, which Trump won handily, the head-to-head between Rubio and Trump was a 1-point race. If you look at Michigan, which Trump won handily, head-to-head with Cruz was ahead by 5 points. What's happened is that Trump has this critical mass of 40%, and Trump was at 35% of the polls in January when there were 17 people in the race. He's at 40% now that there's 3. He has this critical mass that he is holding on to, but this other 60 to 65% has been splintered between candidates who are kind of delusional at times, who think, I'm going to be the guy who gets to go head-to-head with Trump, and then I can be the Republican nominee. Now that we're actually down to 2 or 3 candidates and we're getting into this race for delegates for the convention, Trump has some problems. Indiana is not he's going to do well in the Northeast. That'll probably get him up to about 900 delegates. He needs 1237. But then he hits Indiana, which isn't as favorable, in California. Briefly, California is going to be decided. It's a closed Republican primary, so only Republicans can vote. The delegates are awarded by congressional district. Okay, half of the congressional districts in California gave Barack Obama 63% of the vote or more. These are the people who are going to decide the delegates in California. Who votes in a closed Republican primary in Nancy Pelosi's district? Who votes in a closed Republican primary in the Compton district? Who votes in the center? You can go through all these things where there's going to be like 500 Republican votes cast. That's who's going to, I'm not joking, this is who's going to decide the Republican nomination, okay? The general election, Trump again, barring a meteor strike or an indictment, Trump is not going to defeat Hillary Clinton. He's offended. A Trump-like candidate, I think, is an interesting choice for Republicans who kind of gives up on the economic libertarianism and goes for a more downscale coalition. Not someone like Trump who says all the things like Jeb Bush has to like Hispanics. He needs to speak Mexican to his wife. That's an actual tweet that came out of the Trump camp. That's not going to get you to the presidency. Cruz is a different story. I don't think there are many Democrats that Ted Cruz could beat. Hillary Clinton is an interesting matchup, and I will just close by saying to ask yourself, what are all the things that are downsides for Ted Cruz? Okay, not particularly likable, not necessarily the greatest politician, a little bit out there on policy. Then ask yourself, does this also apply to Hillary Clinton? It is bizarre. They're like bizarro versions of themselves. If Cruz runs against Clinton, it's like Nixon running against Nixon. And I don't know who wins that race, but I think it's a toss-up at this point. We'll see what the economy does.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to take to the prediction markets right now, so you didn't help me out. Steptoe.
I guess it's nice to follow a data geek. I've got some data of my own, but that was really impressive recitation. And it sort of frames what I'm about to say. According to media analysts, Trump's campaign was the second most heavily covered story of 2015. Weather was the first.
I'm going to steal that. That's good.
The media coverage of the presidential candidates has been, I think, the subject of more discussion and criticism of this election cycle than perhaps any other time in modern history or recent history. President Obama accused the media of focusing on theatrics and Twitter hits rather than critical analysis and truth-seeking. Political scientists have decried the irresponsible and outsized media attention, and they say that that has helped fuel Trump's momentum. Columbia Journalism Review called media coverage of the 2016 presidential election among the worst journalism of 2016. And media critics simply say that the media is practicing malpractice, is engaging in malpractice. And so most of these withering critiques, as Sean alluded to, are directed at the coverage of Trump. But honestly, political journalism during the 2016 election cycle has been disappointing and troubling in many respects. It's been fawning. It has appealed to the baser instincts of audiences by treating offensive remarks, violent behavior as great entertainment. And if you don't believe me, consider that Les Moonves, the president and acting chairman of CBS, told financial analysts recently that Trump might not be good for the United States, but it's been good for the network. The media has failed, continuing the list of transgressions, the media has failed to challenge fabrications, inaccurate statements, distortions it has failed to press for policy details behind some of the most lofty and fantastical campaign promises that we've heard. The coverage reflects continually a kind of inside the Beltway perspective rather than the point of view of Main Street USA, which I think explains why everybody missed the potential rise of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, because the media did not anticipate the frustration of the lower and middle class workers in this country. And finally, the sensationalist bent that treats rumor, speculation, and innuendo as facts and news. So that all leads to some really interesting and important questions as we look at sort of the role and responsibility of media, whether facts matter anymore, and whether we should care about them. Voters are now totally, and the American public in general, is totally engaged in social media, which is its own sort of echo chamber, and it makes people feel as if they are informed, and it gives undue importance to opinion over truth and facts. In addition, the media itself is so ratings obsessed and social media hit obsessed that what is truth and fact gets all blurred. And so I think it'll be interesting to explore those questions, and I look forward to hearing everybody's perspectives.
Excellent. You guys are better than law professors because you're given instruction.
That was good.
And you stick to them. All right, there are seats down here, so for those of you who are in the back, we'll give you a dispensation right now if you want to walk on down. There are 7 seats as I count them down here, so please come on down and grab a seat. We'd love for you to be part of the conversation. Excellent. There are 2 right down here, 2 more over here, 1 up there. Right here. Barbara,
Yes.
you're up.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So, I want to start by picking up just a little bit on the media. I head up what's called I'm the new president of the Capitol Press Club, which is the nation's oldest African-American communications organization, founded in 1944 by the Chicago Defender. And it's a nationwide organization because, I've been doing much more around the issue of journalism. In my opinion, everything that we've heard about Trump is correct, but to me, the real missing and the worst reporting by the media has been on the incredible threat to the right to vote and the whole voter suppression movement in this country. I think that there is a huge need for the electronic media in particular to do a better job of covering these issues. Let's talk about it, because the voter suppression movement is the story of 2016. This election will turn out ultimately to be an election about turnout. Who will turn out the most people? Who will vote the most enthusiastically? And sadly, who's willing to stand in lines for 3 and 4 and 5 hours in too many states? There are currently 7 lawsuits taking place in the United States around voter suppression laws. There is the lawsuits in Wisconsin. Wisconsin just had their election about 2 weeks ago. And think about this. One of the gentlemen who was denied the right to vote was a gentleman who had spent $200, gone on 2 trips back to Illinois, because he had recently moved to Wisconsin, to try to get the documentation that Wisconsin demanded that he have. He had 3 really great forms of ID, but they don't accept them. And he went back and he just could not do it. He wasn't allowed to vote. And his case was taken to the circuit court, and the circuit court agreed that this was out of order and ordered the lower court to come up with a better remedial process for people who cannot produce the ID that the state has required. Think about it. One of the people who has been denied, I think actually this has happened in 2 states, who have been denied the right to vote are Holocaust survivors. When you require a birth certificate as a fundamental document to prove someone's identity, it is absolutely injurious. The question becomes, what is the purpose of these laws? If the purpose of the law is in fact to deter voter fraud, then what's being accomplished by keeping a Holocaust survivor from voting? You have to really look at the nexus between the alleged purpose of the law and its actual effect on individuals. You also have the incredible lawsuit in Alabama, where not only did they come up with the voter ID law, most of these cases have been about voter ID, but they've been also about early voting and a whole lot of other issues. And in Alabama, they not only come up with a voter ID law, but then Alabama feels empowered to close the majority of their DMV, Department of Motor Vehicle offices that issue the required ID in the Black community. 13 predominantly black counties, they closed the offices on. That lawsuit is undergoing right now, being led by the NAACP LDF. Texas, you got the VZ case. 600,000 people not able to vote or having issues because of voter ID. This case is pending in the SCOTUS right now for trying to stop the law from going into effect for the general election. And the Fifth Circuit has been all over the place with this case. It's been a very, very strange back and forth with the Fifth Circuit. Of course, we're in North Carolina, where we got the monster bill, as they call it. And that's, of course, in litigation. We have Arizona. Arizona decides to close, think about this, to go from 200 plus polling places to 70 in this environment, in this political environment. No wonder it had, hour-long lines. No wonder it had so many problems. And it was no accident that where those polling places were shuttered were Latino communities, the majority of them. These kinds of, racialized voter impairment strategies are just absolutely, to me, despicable. Virginia, there's a lawsuit pending right now over voter ID. Ohio, Ohio's that crazy state, right? I mean, we just had the 17-year-old voting case. And I always put Ohio on the list because I know they're going to come up with something before the election. And somebody's going to have to sue again because we have to sue them every time. And, we've had one suit. We'll probably have another 2 or 3. Watch Kansas, watch Missouri. No pending lawsuits right now, but there's huge legislative battles going on over the issues of voter suppression laws. So I just want to, say that I believe that the fight for America, ultimately, it doesn't matter to me, frankly. I'm a very nonpartisan person. It doesn't matter to me political party. What does matter to me is democracy. And the failure of our country to appreciate and to really understand what a democratic process looks like, to teach it. Think about all the schools that only teach civics. Why do our students think that demagoguery is in fact an acceptable form of campaigning? All of this is our failure as a country to celebrate, embrace, and to promote our democracy. So in closing, on this week, on the 21st, the Transformative Justice Coalition, which I head up, is going to be holding a congressional briefing on how voter suppression is threatening our democracy. And it will be held, that day, because ultimately The Voting Rights Act, its protection, the Shelby case that gutted, Section 4B of the act and allowed, all this nonsense to to occur because we can't stop it as easily as we used to be able to. All of this is a result of Congress failing to come back and to exercise its authority. So we're going to put the focus back on Congress, work with the congressional members. I don't care what side of the aisle, but until we protect the right to vote for everyone, then our nation is in hot trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara, for bringing law to a panel at a law school. That's really interesting. So Tony's going to bring the international perspective. Tony, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Guy. And I just, as an aside, will say that, Barbara, it is very disturbing to see what's going on. Some of you know my questionable background, but I was, among other things, outside general counsel to the Democratic National Committee, and back in the 80s, I sued the Republican National Committee for voter intimidation and so forth, and got a consent decree from the federal court in New Jersey, consenting, recognizing practice need to be stopped. It's disturbing that it's continuing and probably growing, particularly at state level. I'm going to try to comment on international aspects or implications of the presidential race, although I'm interested in the politics and domestic implications as well. Differences of opinion are welcome and essential and inevitable when we talk about politics and government, of course. A few years back, when I was scheduled to have my 50th reunion at that school going downhill.
Am I going to have to buy you dinner for that one? Because I will.
I've already got a Chick-fil-A card. I was going to give a talk on U.S. exceptionalism, still the one, ? And a strep infection prevented my giving it, but as I saw this occasion coming, I was reminded of it. When I left Brazil, Hope and I left Brazil, President Cardoso of Brazil, who's way above the average U.S. president in his leadership and elect and so forth, at that time, Brazil is a mess now, of course, said to me something that I hadn't thought so much about is, now the U.S. is the only hegemonic power. Never happened this way in any time. Bipolar world having disappeared at that point. And the question is, what are you going to do with it? Well, I think the answer is we haven't done as well as we would have hoped to be doing with it. At that point, we were viewed as the sole superpower and basically a benevolent superpower in the world, I would say. And several key factors, in my opinion, contributed to our decline. One was the invasion of Iraq, which, based on bad intelligence and bad judgment, with essentially no support around the world, destabilizing the region and leading to contributing much to conditions there today. Totally unrelated, the 2008 financial meltdown sort of raised questions about the seat of capitalism, and for some, capitalism itself around the world, and our ability to manage our affairs in that regard. The general decline of the body politic, which I think could be a theme for this election that we're seeing. And of course, other challenges. But the world is watching, hoping, and mystified, I would say, at this point, in what's going on in the U.S., not that the rest of the world isn't having its problems as well. In my firm, in addition to Secretary Albright, we have Secretary Carlos Gutierrez, who was Commerce Secretary under President Bush, So we're a bipartisan group, even though there may be a little tilt in that direction. And we have colleagues around the world, former ambassadors from other countries, former ministers of finance, foreign affairs, and so forth. So we, in a sort of a strange position to pick up what people are thinking, get questions all the time about what's happening. And I would say, generally speaking, leaders around the world have a sense that they know Hillary Clinton and are comfortable with Hillary Clinton. Many of them know her personally, of course, and they're in shock at Donald Trump. They don't know Cruz or Kasich particularly. They don't know Sanders particularly, but I would say they wonder about his experience to govern and the practicability of his positions. On the other hand, I would say many of them would see a Jeb Bush or a Governor Kasich as reassuring choices if we were making those kinds of choices. I spent 3 days with Jeb Bush when I was ambassador in Brazil and reached the conclusion that he was presidential material, like his father, who was, I think, a very good man. Is a very good man. And I sort of suspected he would be president, as did so many Republicans and otherwise. On-the-job training for this office is not sufficient. It requires some meaningful public experience. It requires thoughtfulness, judgment, a sense of history, sense of the institutions, frankly, a respect for the rule of law. And so much of what you hear being said by candidates ignores the rule of law, ignores the Constitution, I would say, even. So Trump is a very scary factor, and he's probably been the scariest to the rest of the world because a lot of things he said relating to our place in the world, immigration and the wall, hostile positions on China, which we certainly have our issues, but most thoughtful world leaders would consider the most important bilateral relationship in the world is how the U.S. and China relate to each other at this time and for some time. Banning all Muslims from coming in, the country that religious freedom is a bedrock of our Constitution and doctrines, undoing trade deals that are already approved and enforced, approved by Congress, going after NATO, a mutual complementary society with Vladimir Putin. So on and on. It's a pretty scary proposition. I'm glad to hear the prognostication as we began that it's not going to happen, and I think I agree with it. It's just so scary to face the possibility. I think not just Donald Trump, but this race, which has gone from 17 candidates down to a much smaller number at this point, is risk of destroying the GOP, or if not destroying it, severely damaging what's been bedrock of our body politic, two-party system. And as we think back about other Republicans in the past, the leadership generally, as I said, the decline of the body politic, leadership, willingness of very able, thoughtful people to serve in public office is declining. But in the past, people like, Carlos Gutierrez in my firm, former Senator Warren Rudman from New Hampshire, who was also a co-chair in our firm before. But I would say people like John Boehner and Paul Ryan are people you could respect. John Boehner, I believe, had he been able to gain the cooperation of certain elements of his party, would have done something with President Obama very seriously about our fiscal situation. So there's been a weeding out process, but in my opinion, the Republican primary process has weeded out both the good and the bad. There's some that were ridiculous, but Jeb Bush was not a ridiculous candidate. I'll reserve comments on some of the others, I think, so as not to take up as much time on their standing in the world or otherwise.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm glad we didn't call this panel, make this panel great again. So I'm going to ask one question, and you'll each have about a minute to answer it, and then we'll open it up. And you can act like law professors and ignore the question and answer whatever it is that you want.
Or politicians.
Or politicians, but so feel free. So two concepts, one of which has been mentioned in this panel and the other has not, I want to throw on the table and get your reactions to. We clearly live in an extremely polarized society. I don't know if you saw the headline the other day that people find people of their same party more attractive than people of the other party, right? So all of a sudden you find someone and you think they're attractive and you ask them what party they are and it's of a different party. Like, no, you're actually ugly now. So it is interesting that we're so polarized that physical attraction is viewed through those lenses, and so much is viewed through either party polarization. And I want you to think about, especially in this context, if you might say a word about both polarization, but also the deep dissatisfaction that seems to exist within this country, certainly within certain pockets of the country, and how one can be responsive. How can we live together when we are so polarized and there's such deep dissatisfaction? It's not even clear exactly what that is, but if you might say a word about what you think that is both with respect to the polarization as well as to what we see to be, and dissatisfaction across the spectrum, right? I mean, I think you could see that clearly in the two ends of the parties. So it seems to be across the spectrum that we see deep angst and anxiety and dissatisfaction within the country, especially at this time period. So I'll throw that to you. You each have about a minute, and then we'll open up to everybody else.
It's all FDR's fault.
Perfect. Done.
No, and it actually kind of is. So we had geographic parties for a long time, but there were also huge ideological, and it was hugely polarized and nasty. Like, that's actually the rule in American politics. And then FDR gets elected, and he says, this is a quote, "I don't know if there's going to be a Democratic Party when I'm done, but there sure as hell will be a progressive party." And he starts purging the Southern Democrats, and he starts this process that we've kind of lived through, where the parties were realigning from geographically polarized parties to ideologically polarized parties. And it took about 80 years for it to all work out. But we're kind of at the end game of that process now. So I guess what I'm saying is most of us grew up in a honeymoon from history, where we just kind of had this strange events where the parties kind of mixed. You had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans and people from the North and people from the South. Now we've sorted out. And that's how we got to this kind of nasty situation. As far as the dissatisfaction, I mean, I think something that a lot of people probably in this room don't come to terms with is that what's going on, I think, is that globalization has winners and losers. And the losers tend not to be in this room, and the losers are in both parties, but they tend not to be in the hierarchy of both parties. I mean, what are the two issues, probably the only two issues that the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times agree upon? Trade and immigration. Okay, I think in the long term they're beneficial to everyone, but in the short run, you have Democrats that lose and you have Republicans that lose, and they don't really have a voice in either party in the leadership. And that's what's driving the Sanders candidacy to a large degree. That's what's driving the Trump candidacy to a large degree. More than a few people commented that if you went to an Occupy Wall Street rally and then you went to a Tea Party rally, you'd hear a lot of the same rhetoric. It's the same dissatisfaction, especially since we're in a period of relatively low growth, so the pie isn't growing as fast. That's what's driving all this.
Thank you.
I'll stick with the media because that's been a major contributing factor, the sort of growth of the echo chambers. Rush talk radio I think, was an early sort of adapter of this model. The emergence of Rush Limbaugh, so that people could listen to him and get all their news from him. And if they agreed with him, that's all they needed to listen. If they didn't want to hear from anybody else. Fox News sort of expanded on that model, brought it to TV, cable news, and then all the other major networks sort of picked their spot along that spectrum. At least NBC did, right, with MSNBC. CNN tries to play it down the middle with mixed success. But Fox News and Rush Limbaugh helped create an echo chamber that allowed people who had conservative viewpoints. It gave them a home where they could get all of the information they thought they needed and wanted, and they no longer had to listen to opposing points of view. So that's fed a lot of the partisanship, I think. And in terms of the deep dissatisfaction, the market crash, and Sean just referenced the one percenters, the Occupy Wall Street movement. That, I think, also precipitated a lot of the dissatisfaction. Working class people saw big banks that were guilty or at least alleged, and there was proof, gross malfeasance and fraud, getting away with it, being bailed out. So, as Sean mentioned, that spawned Bernie Sanders' rhetoric about the corrupt financial system and the big banks needing to be broken up. And Trump feeds into that as well. You've gotten the shaft. America's no longer great because it doesn't work. But the other part of what doesn't often get said, but everybody seems to sort of understand it, is the election of Barack Obama has fed a lot of dissatisfaction among a certain class of voters. The Republicans in Congress have fomented it by being obstructionist, and therefore they've tried to spin the story and sell the story that America's not working, that the ideas that are being put forth are not good for the country, that they're destroying the country, that this administration is doing things that have reduced America's stature around the world and has wrecked the domestic economy and the domestic sort of social fabric. So those are some of the contributing factors, in my opinion, to this dissatisfaction and bipartisanship.
Barbara?
Polarization.
Yes. I would say that it's a collision of values, right? It's the issue in the United States as to polarization. It's the problem of the demographic change. We are a country that, without doubt, will no longer be a majority white country. And the problem, I always say this, the problem of the demos, right? It's it's the issue of the people. The demographics is actually driving a lot of people's dissatisfaction with the democracy. And a lot of this is dependent on a view and a vision of an America that is not this new America that's emerging, that is racially diverse, that is very, very much more progressive in its vantage points, because we got young folks who are talking with folks all over the country, all over the world, and learning about different kinds of economic systems and being attracted to those. It is this problem of our inability to evolve leaders who can really be statespeople and talk about how we go from who we are now to this new society. Instead, what we do is we talk about taking back our country. And all this other nonsense. I mean, you cannot stop the incredible evolution of this country. I think the second factor that is occurring is the natural devolution of the Southern strategy of the Republican Party. This was a strategy that predictably only worked as long as you had a white majority. The minute you start having a much more racially diverse electorate, the ability of the Southern strategy to prevail just doesn't work. And it was, and unfortunately, the Republican Party doubled down on the Southern strategy over the years. And I think some of what Sonja talked about the Obama hatred over the last 7 years, reflects that. Think about this. Trump voters. 20% of all Trump voters think slavery was just fine. Just fine, according to the polling. In the Republican Party, sadly, the majority think Obama is a Muslim from that great foreign nation of Hawaii. This is tragic. And I think the inability of our leaders to really talk about race well, to talk about the need to build a new racially diverse society and the benefits of that society so that people stop being feared, just dominated by fear, I think that's the issue. I agree totally with the economic analysis. All of us, lost great wealth during the recession. Actually, people of color lost the most wealth, still have the hardest climb back from that situation. But nevertheless, it's left a bitterness in all of us. And I think that that's, clearly real. But I think the failure to address the racial dynamic is the failure, because only when you have that racial dynamic going can you talk really powerfully about building your big, lovely wall, and making Mexico pay for it. But anyway, thank you.
Tony. So, Tony, it seems this is a global phenomenon, it seems to me, the satisfaction. Can you talk a little bit about that, if that's true or not, fairly quickly?
Well, that theme I mentioned, U.S. exceptionalism, still the one question mark. That's a question for us and a question for the rest of the world. I think it captures a good bit of what's going on here. Basically, so many people in this country are damn mad right now. Yeah. And as Sean said, some of it is understandable, some of it is rectifiable, remediable. Some of it is a consequence of forces that very hard to flip switches on. Basically, globalization has changed the way of the world. We could exist as countries to ourselves much more in the past. The U.S. was benefited by being an island, a continental country or whatever. Now the world is interconnected, jobs flee, economics forces demand that companies do things in order to remain competitive against foreign competition and so forth. So people are mad that there's not the same respect for America around the world. And people are mad about some of the things I mentioned, and others have mentioned, the financial mismanagement or lack of will in the country, the economic things that happened, whether they could have been avoided or not. Trump is a master, I must say, at master salesman, perhaps. The Make America Great Again, wave the wand and we'll make America great again, was a perfect handle to apply to the anger and fear, two very significant factors among the American public. And it's so easy to grab hold of something like that. Damn right. Even though he never gives the answer to what you would do to accomplish these things. And if he does, it sounds ridiculous. It indicates he doesn't know what he's talking about. To some extent, on the other end of the spectrum, applies a little bit with Bernie Sanders. When you get down to the specifics of how you're going to pay for all this, and presidents are limited in their powers by the Constitution and our system of checks and balances.
So let's take some questions. I'll take 3 or so at a time, just so that we can get as many on the table as possible. Yes, sir, in the back.
Could someone comment on gerrymandering and polarization?
Okay, so gerrymandering. What else? Let's take, and I saw a hand over here. We'll take a few at a time. Yes, sir.
Trump doesn't get the nomination, what happens to the Republican Party? Will there be a third-party candidacy?
All right. What happens if Trump doesn't get the nomination? Yes, ma'am, down here.
There's been much criticism of the media, and I'm curious if there is a solution.
Okay, solution. All right. Yeah, how about some hope? How about some hope here? Okay, sure, one more.
My concern is, what if there's a Paris or Brussels-style attack in Times Square on October 30th? Because I remember being in this building in 1980 until my colleagues and professors saying, Ronald Reagan washed up after, he'll never become president, don't worry about it. And it happened. Yogi Berra's great comment, deja vu all over again. Would that happen again?
Excellent, great question. So gerrymandering, what happens to the Republican Party if Trump doesn't win? Criticisms of the media, let's have some solutions. And hey, what if you are wrong, Sir Trende, and in fact, something happens and the Brussels-style attack, and maybe Trump does become president? So 4 questions. Take it away. Try to be as quick as you possibly can. Thank you.
Gerrymandering.
Stop.
I'm going to pass on the media question because we have an expert next to me. And I'll
Just pick one.
You
don't have to answer all 4. Just pick one.
I'll do 2.
Okay. Excellent.
2 of particular interest to me. Gerrymandering is, whatever you think of it, it isn't linked to polarization, and I can do it quick. Why is the Senate also polarizing at the same rate as the House? It's not gerrymandered. There you have it. On the Paris style attack, I think if Trump weren't as over-the-top offensive as he is, didn't have a negative 70 favorability rating like he does, that would be a real concern for him getting elected. The problem is that he's just made himself unacceptable, or the benefit, as I tend to think, he's made himself unacceptable to too broad of a swath of the electorate for something like that to matter. I mean, I am someone who generally believes elections are driven by fundamentals, not personalities. And tell me what the economy is, tell me the president's job approval, I can tell you who will win 6 months out, generally speaking. Trump, we're going to have to put a dummy variable on all our all our presidential models going forward because he's become so radioactive that I think he's the exception to that at this point.
Okay.
I have hope that the media's sort of well-worn tradition of the inevitable 3-stage cycle of coverage, which we're already starting to see play out with the coverage of Donald Trump, will serve as a self-correcting device. So the 3 stages, I call them the 3 Ds. First, they're dismissive of this phenomenon as a joke or as something, as a flash in the pan. Once Trump beat those expectations, became this sort of phenomenon, they fell in love with him, he became the darling. Then there's always a watershed event. For Sarah Palin, it was the Katie Couric interview, when suddenly the emperor has no clothes. It's happened with Trump, with the Chris Matthews interview, with the Washington Post editorial board meeting, which they published the full delicious transcript of. And the violence at his rallies, I think, has contributed to this. And so people are starting to open their eyes. The media is starting to open its eyes to Trump. And of course, now the pendulum is swinging completely, extremely in the opposite direction. Every utterance is now ridiculous and ridiculed, and so, and he's treated with disdain. That's the third stage, and that's where we are with Trump. So I think media sort of eventually comes around and takes up its duties and corrects itself. The other solution might...
Please.
The clock's ticking. The other solution is to bifurcate the coverage of these candidates. So it's like the sports model. You send the beat reporters out with the team because access is the mother's milk of journalism. So you've got to have somebody on your team who has all the access, who smiles, laughs at all the jokes, just serves as the sort of dictation, the transcriber. It doesn't ask a lot of tough questions because they don't want to anger anybody and lose their press privileges. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there's a team of investigative reporters, for lack of a better term, that asks the tough questions, that digs into the details and holds people's feet to the fire and holds them accountable. The Washington Post has that model. The New York Times has that model. Sports Illustrated has that model. Time Magazine has that model. The media needs to really, I think, adhere to that model and really be true to it. And I think that would go a long way to solving some of the problems.
Thank you. Barbara.
Yes, on gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a huge threat. It's, the most important election. 2016 is very key, but 2018 is the election. And the problem is that people don't vote midterm. And midterms is where we get some of these horrific state legislatures. So the most important thing between now and 2018 is awakening the American public to vote midterm. I think there's no way you can get around that. The other significant factor that we just can't ignore sitting up here is that American politics contract and go through all kinds of, different evolutions over the years and over the decades. And we should recognize that right now, among our young voters, more are registered as independents than as members of any political party. That says a lot. It either tells us that they're searching for a better new political party, or that they don't want alignment and alliance to any political party. We don't know enough about what's going on with this phenomenon, but that phenomenon will absolutely play out in the years to come in both parties. And I think that we're going to probably see, some real change regarding, the party structure if the GOP survives this year. Lastly, on media, I think that the real reality is that CNN and and ABC and all the rest of them continue to have some dominance, but the internet will become increasingly more important, and its accuracy base, of course, has been its biggest challenge. But I think that we can just expect that more and more people will be looking to alternative news sources as their predominant information source, and that those of us who are engaged in media have to really be thinking how to continue to build content that is available to people's explorations. So, that's my take on it.
Tony, you get the last word.
Yeah.
All right. Gerrymandering, I think, is a major contributor to the polarization in this country. Yeah. Safe districts for extremes. Campaign finance, I think, is also a significant problem. I disagree with my friend and former partner, John Roberts, on the subject. Republican Party, big question, who knows what will happen. I think Paul Rhyne is a good man, and people will tend to look to him to save the party, but being Speaker of the House is a pretty big job in itself. there could well be a tendency for opening up more to independent candidates, new parties or whatever. Brazil has, I think, 28 political parties. And President Clinton and Cardozo had a debate about which is worse, having one other party to fight with or that number. So I hate to end on this note, but terrorism also was a question. And as mentioned, I spent about 5 years in leading presidential intelligence oversight, not operational, obviously. And great respect for the intelligence community and what is done, I think, in terms of security in today's world where armies can't really do the job. It's even more crucial. I hate to say it, but I was not surprised by 9/11 in terms of the possibility of a major terrorist act against the U.S., even though the spectacle was shocking. And I think we have to expect the way terrorism has evolved, there will be terrorist acts in the U.S. It's almost as if I were president, I would have a very difficult choice to make right now on whether to prepare people for the possibility a little bit more so that the reaction is not cataclysmic for the country as a whole, or avoid scaring the public, which is what we tend to try to do. It's not scare the public about what might happen. But I think there could be at any time one or more attacks. I think it would have an impact on the election. I'm not quite sure what it would be. My impact is I sure want Hillary Clinton to be in the White House with her experience and knowledge and judgment, which I've seen firsthand at a great extent, than some of the other people we've talked about.
Thank you.
Let's go.
You're making me run to my bunker in the basement right now. So this is a tremendous panel. You all have been great as well. Sorry we couldn't get more questions in. Please join me one more time in thanking our wonderful panelists, all of whom, like you, graduated from Duke Law School.
Right.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Yes. It's
Pleasure.
really quite a pleasure.
Yeah, good group.